Hi, this is Paul. I want to get back to this book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, and I want to go through Truman's treatment of Rousseau. Now, this does very much bear on the assumptions beneath our culture of what is right and wrong and what is authentic. In the video I posted this morning, too short a video, I talked a little bit about authority. And as I was listening to this book this morning on my morning walk, I thought about the relationship between authority and authenticity in terms of what we imagine the authorship, the author of our life and world is. And that very much bears on this section with Rousseau. Also in this section with Rousseau, we deal with the word nature, which for those of you following my adult Sunday school class that I've been reposting here on this channel, very much gets into Romans 1 and Paul's discussion of nature. And this dealing with this word is critically important for what we have going on. So I'm going to pick up the book using the audio book here in this chapter. First, he's going to do a little bit of comparison between Augustine and Rousseau. Now, the chapter is entitled The Other Genevan, which is very clever because, of course, John Calvin is perhaps Geneva's most famous. He's not really a son of Geneva. He was a Dutch refugee who fled to Geneva from France. And Rousseau is the other Genevan. And because Calvin is in many ways an Augustinian, Rousseau is sort of the opposite of an Augustinian. Now, I mentioned I did a little show on breaking the rules, something like that. And met a guy. I want to have a conversation with him, a former young, restless, and reformed Calvinist, someone who was excommunicated from the PCA, and obviously got involved with a lot of young, restless, and reformed Calvinist fascination with particular ideas and theologies, which in some ways have their roots in Augustine. So let's pick up the comparison between Augustine and Rousseau, and then let's get into this question of our nature.
A further similarity can be seen in what does not motivate the crime. Augustine, like Rousseau, denies that his crime was motivated by greed. He is explicit that he had better pears in his own garden, to which he had easy and legitimate access.
Now this is the very famous story from Augustine's Confessions, where Augustine contemplates the fact that when he was a boy, he stole pears. And he didn't steal them because he needed them. The pears weren't particularly good. He and his friends didn't even eat them. But they found a degree of pleasure as a group in the theft. And so in Augustine's Confessions, he ponders that theft of pears. And this is compared with Rousseau, a story about a theft of asparagus.
It is not the possession of better and more attractive pears, nor even the mere possession of further pears of any quality, that lies behind the act, any more than it was Rousseau's desire for asparagus that drove him to crime. Personal gain is not a motive. Yet this does not mean that Augustine shares the same positive motivation with Rousseau. For Augustine, the theft is not the result of a good desire misdirected, as it is for Rousseau, but rather of the sheer sinful delight to be had in breaking the law. The difference between the two is instructive. For Augustine, the moral flaw is ultimately intrinsic to him. He is by nature wicked, a sinner. Circumstances merely provide an opportunity for a particular action to reveal the immorality of his innate inner disposition. And he is answerable to an external law, indeed a law grounded in the being of God.
Now, this question of our nature tends to be unifocal. Are we good or bad? And some would definitely say, well, we're both. We have the potentiality for good and bad in us. And so, again, I want us to remember while we talk like this about the monofocality of consciousness, because monofocality sort of divides into a bifocality, good, bad. And we tend to task switch in our consciousness. It's sort of hard for us to keep two things present before us at once. And so Augustine and Rousseau are going to divide on this.
which his sinful will takes a strange, perverse delight in breaking. For Rousseau, by way of contrast, his natural humanity is fundamentally sound, and the
Okay, his natural humanity. Now, we're going to have to pay close attention to this word, and I want us to very much keep in mind upper and lower registers. Now, for those of you who are don't listen to every single one of my videos, which has to be many of you, what I mean by upper registers is sort of this division between heaven and earth. I often illustrate it with the story that my grandmother told me when I was a college student. I visited her. And of course, I was in my early 20s, young, vigorous, full of life, probably near the peak of my, of my physiological health. And she was at that point in her 80s. She died at 91. She was in her 80s, and she pretty much looked at me one day and said, inside, I still feel something close to your age. And when I look in the mirror, I'm old. Now, of course, part of us knows that when I've got these two screens in front of me. When I look at myself in the camera, I see that, yes, I'm old. I have all of this gray hair on my chin and all of my first blonde and then brown hair and then brown curly hair on top of my head is all gone. And now I have all this white curly hair under my chin. But inside, I haven't aged. The book of Ecclesiastes says we have eternity within us. Well, what does that mean? Well, there's a way in which I am sort of a story psychologically inside of me. And whereas the book, let's just grab a book here. It's a Jordan Peterson's book. This book itself is subject to decay. It can thieves break in and steal. If it's left outside, it'll get mold and eventually it'll go away. But in a sense, the book that it contains is not physical in the way that the book is. And in a similar way, we sometimes talk about the human soul. Am I fundamentally a material creature that you can sort of poke, and if I clap my hands, I make enough contact to move air and give this slapping sound? Or am I this very different creature that actually has a past and a present and a future? I have extended myself through this technology all the way over to you. I am in some ways an autobiography that I have been telling myself since a very young age. It's sort of morphed in subtle ways as I grew and developed and transformed. But there's an eternal part of me and there's a decaying part of me. And both of those are right here. And that's true of all of us. Does America age? Well, you might ask, well, what is America? Well, America is a nation. Does the United States government have a body? All of these questions, well, this is all sort of in upper and lower registers, because the upper register is sort of heaven. Okay, that's why it's upper. And it doesn't decay, and it doesn't age. The upper register of Jordan Peterson's book, Beyond Order, is, in a sense, the words that he composed, adjusted, I'm sure, by an editor, that are in some ways eternal. Now you might say, well, what if we destroyed every single copy of his book and wiped all the computers and wiped everything? Would it still exist? The more you think about it, it's kind of a hard question to answer. And so we're sort of in the upper and lower registers, and so much of life is sort of there. Now, when we talk about our nature with respect to that which moves my behavior, that which moved young Augustine to steal the pears, or that which moved Rousseau to steal the asparagus. Now, often when we talk this way, we talk about spiritual things. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, it's the upper register, immaterial, not subject to decay, whatever that moves the material subject to decay, in-fleshed things here on the ground. Okay, so we have the tie between these things. Now, so then when we talk about our nature, well, I clearly sometimes do what we would call good, and I clearly sometimes do what we would call bad or evil. Well, what in me brings me to do this? Why did Augustine steal the pears? And we immediately go to psychological things. Psychological tends to be upper register. Physiological tends to be lower register. So we want to talk about our nature.
A sinful act comes from social pressures and conditioning. He becomes depraved by the pressures society places on him.
Okay, and so Rousseau wants to say that it's society that moves me to do evil things. And so young Augustine was good, but it was the peer pressure of his friends that moved him to steal the pears. Now one might ask, well, where did that evil come then into his friends? Because if this nature, which is sort of a universal thing, was true of Augustine and true of all of us, certainly would have been true in his friends. And so in some ways, this question of Rousseau's has to deal with the question, well, where does evil come from? And now, this division that I'm showing here between Augustine and Rousseau is fairly well known, but where Truman goes with it is very helpful, because we have to see sort of the nature of this nature that Rousseau is pursuing.
We might therefore summarize the basic difference between the two men as follows. Augustine blames himself for his sin because he is basically wicked from birth. Rousseau blames society for his sin because he is basically good at birth and then perverted by external forces.
Now, of course, good at birth is a fairly easy thing if you've at least had... Rousseau, of course, quite famously gave his children away and didn't take any responsibility in raising them. And what we're going to find as we get into what Rousseau understands by his terms is that they're not exactly the way we think about these terms, generally speaking. And whereas when a baby is born, and I've been there for 5 of them, 5 of my own, they're these little soft creatures that are completely helpless and completely dependent on their mother for their sustenance. And well, by the time they're 2, especially if you listen to people who study 2-year-olds, well, the most violent human beings we have are 2-year-olds. And the reason that our jails aren't full of them is because they're so small, and because we also understand that for all of Rousseau's imagining that we are born good and learn evil, well, a 2-year-old might be the greatest example of why he's wrong. But in fairness to Rousseau, you have to begin to understand what he means, and we will get into that if I would stop talking.
What the account of the asparagus does is point to the fact that, for Rousseau, the social order is a source of falsehood, or to use the modern term, inauthenticity.
And that is key. So falsehood and inauthenticity. Now pay attention to that word, authenticity, authorship, authority. And as we go through this, we should pay attention to authenticity and authority.
Men and women are born good and corrupted by the society that surrounds them. As Charles Taylor expresses Rousseau's thinking, the original impulse of nature is right, but the effect of a depraved culture is that we lose contact with it.
Okay, the original impulse of nature. Well, again, what is this word nature? You can hear it in my Sunday school class. Often go to C.S. Lewis's, I can pull it up now. This is from his book Miracles, and we ask, well, what do we mean by nature? Well, this actually is a fairly complex word, and it even all the way back into antiquity, it's used for a number of things. Lewis, of course, says, well, he goes down. He's trying to talk about natural and supernatural. I begin by considering the following sentences: are those his natural teeth or a set? No one would say this is. Everyone would agree this is my natural hair, or lack of it, because I haven't done anything to repopulate the top of my head with hair. The dog in his natural state is covered with fleas. I love to get away from tilled land and metalled roads, to be alone in nature, capital N. Do be natural. Why are you so affected? In other words, there's this impulse of rationality, of self-consciousness, of internal agency that disrupts that which would be instinctive to us, that which would be that which would not require any higher level of thought. The natural dog is covered with fleas. The domesticated dog has been given things that we create to interrupt the flea's reproductive cycle when it bites the dog. So the heartworm and the flea pill are given to the dog once a month, and the dog doesn't have fleas, and the fleas aren't in the house. Now dogs are very wonderfully and fairly easily domesticated, and we've been doing it for a very long time. And reason does this, because we have a reason we don't want fleas in the house, and our language is covered with this. Now, of course, the supernatural dog is the talking dog, or the talking dog is the supernatural dog. A common thread of meaning in all these usages can be easily discovered. The natural teeth are those in which grow in the mouth. The natural hair is that which grows or does not grow on top of my head. We do not have to design them, make them, or fit them. The dog's natural state is one he will be in if no soap or water is applied to him. The countryside where nature reigns as supreme is the one where soil, weather, and vegetation produce their results unhelped or unimpeded by us, humanity, with our designs, with our consciousness, with our intent. Nature is what goes on its own. The natural kiss, which would be given if moral or prudential considerations do not intervene. In all of these examples, nature means what happens of itself or of its own accord. What you do not need to labor for, what you will get if you take no measure to stop it. The Greek word for nature, physis, is connected with the Greek verb to grow. Latin natura with the verb to be born. Nature is what springs up or comes forth or arrives or goes on of its own accord. The given, what is already, the spontaneous, the unintended, the unsolicited. Now he gets into the whole show and natural and supernatural, but that's not what this video is about. So we noticed, now this is really key for Rousseau, because this is our natural self and this is good. And you're going to say, well, wait a minute. We just had Me Too and all of these things. And we have, just today, the Hillsong, the founder of the Hillsong churches stepped down because apparently he had sent some texts while he was under the influence of certain medications and something, and he had loosed his inhibitions, and he had texted a woman some of his thoughts that, well, if he didn't have a phone, she never would have known, but they slipped out of his fingers onto her, and she was upset, and this is 10 years ago, and now he's done. And so, okay, how bad is nature? Well, we're going to have to dig a little deeper into Rousseau, because Rousseau is very much beneath much of our world.
The second incident makes this point very clear. It is Rousseau's description and analysis of an encounter he had in Venice with a prostitute called Zulietta. In fact, so important is this incident to Rousseau that he claims it as the one incident in my life which portrays my nature in its true colors.
Okay, his nature. Now, this makes sense, because Rousseau obviously isn't feeling the same kinds of rational, interruptive restrictions as the founder of Hillsong.
The events of the encounter are easy to relate. Rousseau visits Zulietta and is struck by her beauty and charm. Immediately, he starts to experience feelings of inferiority and unworthiness in her presence. Why should he have such a wonderful creature at his disposal to do with as he wished? Agitated to the point of tears, Rousseau suddenly notices that one of her nipples is malformed, and this observation, trivial as it is, immediately changes everything. Now he surmises that this defect is a sign of some natural vice, and the woman who one moment had been to him like a goddess is suddenly a vicious monster. The question as to why Rousseau regards this encounter as so critical for enabling the reader to understand him does not actually emerge in the story itself, but is revealed at the start of Book 8, our third incident. It is then that Rousseau recounts a momentous journey from Paris to Vincennes to visit his friend Denis Diderot. On the way, he comes across...
Now, Diderot is one of the philosophes, and he creates this elaborate encyclopedia. This is the dawn of the Enlightenment. And so you have Rousseau, and you have Voltaire, and you have Diderot, and you have all these figures that are sort of breaking free from the constraint of the church and Christianity and medieval Catholicism, and they're using knowledge to blaze this new trail and this new world. And it's a small group of individuals.
Across a copy of the newspaper Mercure de France, and reads therein about an essay competition being held by the Academy of Dijon. The question on which contestants are asked to write is this: whether the restoration of the sciences and arts has contributed to the purification of morals.
Now that's interesting because, well, science and arts. Now, I interrupt the audiobook a lot. And unlike the Jordan Peterson videos, you can't just find this audiobook on YouTube. You have to go out there and buy it, or you can read the book yourself. And I'm doing what I'm doing, I believe, well within the constraints of fair use, because I'm giving commentary and analysis, and I believe I am actually enhancing the commercial viability of the book rather than degrading it. But think of, in some ways, the Enlightenment as a further continuation of the Renaissance. And they're concerned about morals and what's the relationship between beauty and morality. And that's not exactly an easy thing. And of course, with the struggle during the Enlightenment between the traditional Roman Catholic Church, of course, you've got the Protestants out there now too, and including the Reformed, John Calvin, and these are all before Rousseau's time. You've got the question of, well, is this good for morals? Well, what are morals? Well, morals are the right and the wrong that directs us towards betterment, towards a better life.
Rousseau decides to submit an entry, and as he describes in the Confessions, the basic framework of his mature system comes to him as he walks toward Vincennes, such that he arrives there in a state of great excitement and agitation. It is in reflecting on this question that Rousseau later sees himself as making his breakthrough, his equivalent of Augustine's conversion to Christianity.
Okay, and of course, Rousseau's book is entitled the same as Augustine's book. And so in some ways, I think it's not hard to see that Rousseau is, well, we have Augustine, and Augustine says by nature we're prone to sin, we're totally depraved. No, by nature we're good. Okay, but again, why would the 2-year-old be worse than the socialized 14-year-old or 22-year-old? Certainly the 14 or the 22-year-old, especially by use of the term socialized, is the moral superior to the 2-year-old. The 2-year-old might in some way be innocent. Well, what do I mean by innocent? The 2-year-old smacks the fellow 2-year-old and bites and fights and does all of these things, but we don't lock 2-year-olds in jail. Why? Because they are, we say, innocent even though they're guilty. Well, in what way are they innocent? Well, they don't know better. Well, it's all of this additional knowing better that is, in fact, all the socialization and all of the stuff that's coming from the society. So again, when you read Rousseau and you listen to Rousseau, on one hand, he's easy to dismiss. But as Carl Trueman points out, but a lot of what Rousseau taught is also deep within our cultural imaginary. And these ideas, or at least portions of these ideas that set in, are deep in our assumptions about good, bad, right, and wrong, and most importantly, authority and authenticity.
The essay he writes for this competition is his famous Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts, the first discourse, which sets forth in an admittedly rather confused manner the essential principles of his later thinking. The connection to the Venice incident with the prostitute is this. Rousseau has come to understand that people are not monsters by nature, but by virtue of their social conditioning.
Okay, they're not monsters by nature. Okay, what do we mean by nature in that sense? They're not monsters by virtue of lower register. That's part of it. By virtue of not being intercepted like the fleas on the dog, or like the plow in the field, or like the designs and reason and interruption of our designs and plots on that which has simply seemingly come of its own, unbidden, unheeded, or at least untouched by human hands, we might say.
And it is the imagination that mystifies and thereby hides the real causes of corruption. Zulietta was neither goddess nor monster. Her deformed nipple was not the result of some moral judgment, divine or otherwise metaphysical, on her life.
Now that's classic enlightenment. Because whereas in the medieval mindset, in some ways the discarded image, you've got Aristotle underneath there, reworked into Christianity via Aquinas, and also Augustine and Calvinism, that all that is presented of us is in some ways the result of God, number one. God, number two, too. Yes. But the nuance here. So what is the natural Zulietta, the prostitute of Venice? Can you know her? Well, in that way, the natural is also sort of upper register. And this is what we get to in terms of the hypothetical and primeval state of nature.
Or the physical manifestation of her inner depravity. Her prostitution was the result of social circumstances, not some intrinsic flaw.
Ah, right there. I say, well, yeah, I agree with that. Her prostitution, she wasn't a natural born prostitute. Surely she was forced into that degrading profession by virtue of the circumstances of society, etc., etc. Now, of course, we just sort of forget that. Well, Rousseau, aren't you contributing to this? Now, again, if you do any reading of Rousseau's life, Peterson likes to point this out too. Pretty despicable character. Good old Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the let's say one of the founding fathers of modern authenticity.
And this realization was what set Rousseau on his path to demonstrate that it is social institutions that breed corruption and wickedness, a point that was to have huge repercussions for his later thinking about society, ethics, and the individual.
Now this will be important when we get to the fact that, well, if it's social institutions that are the source of the appalling situation of the prostitute of Venice, well, can't we address this if we address social institutions? Because if we're by nature good, well, all we have to do is improve society, and the natural goodness within us will come out.
The hypothetical and primeval state of nature. The essay that Rousseau submitted to the Mercure de France has come down to us as his first discourse. This work is remarkable not so much for its careful and cogent argument, it is arguably neither careful nor cogent, but for its bracing rhetoric. Ever the contrarian, Rousseau addressed the prized topic by arguing the precise opposite of what might be expected. Rather than affirming the inherently civilizing power of the arts and sciences, Rousseau accuses them of lying at the root of modern vices.
Okay, now that's critical because, well, deep within the Renaissance, well, I remember it was decades ago now, so getting old gets you. There used to be this rather funny little, you'd have a guy from the back with a trench coat opening himself up in front of a masterpiece. Expose yourself to art. Well, the whole process of civilization and of finer things and of the classics is the assumption that if we expose each other to the canons of Western civilization, that will mean the betterment of the world. And so, in fact, the university system was built on, exposing young people, civilizing them, civitas, the city, citifying them with the elements that have created cities. That's how you improve people, by exposing them to the finer things. And you can find this all the way up to My Fair Lady. What that whole movie is about, exposing this girl to finer things. Now, you might compare My Fair Lady to Pretty Woman. And in many ways, My Fair Lady is classical Western, and Pretty Woman is Rousseauian, because it's her nature. She's just the victim of a bunch of bad turns, and now once she has you're going to have to, again, if you deal with Rousseau, there's a whole bunch of other problems that arise. But again, so many of these other problems sort of get forgotten or washed away, but the deep kernel is that deep down inside, we're naturally good. And so if you can get rid of all the accretions, well, then you can expose the goodness. Now, a year or so ago, I was doing quite a bit more reading into Nazi theology and philosophy. And there's actually a fair amount of this beneath Nazism, because the idea is that, well, you get rid of all of the accretions and you get down to the lower register purely. In a sense, the Nazis partly got rid of the upper register and only the lower register. Well, if you get rid of all of the slave ideology and let the naturally strong finally hold the world like they should, by getting rid of the weak and the imperfect. But some of that is beneath this too. So some of this is beneath that too.
Consistent with his account of Vera and Zulieta, he presents the case for civilization, not individuals, being the source of social ills. Thus, in part 1, he expresses the problem as follows. How sweet it would be to live among us, if the outward countenance were always the image of the heart's dispositions, if decency were virtue, if our maxims were our rules, if genuine philosophy were inseparable from the title of philosopher, before art had fashioned our manners and taught our passions to speak in ready-made term, our morals were rustic but natural, and differences in conduct conveyed differences of character at first glance.
Now you can even see hints of anti-intellectualism in here. I mean, this idea has gotten into our imagination so deep that you'll find it lodged beneath many different places in our culture.
This is one of Rousseau's earliest expressions of what he imagined it must have been like for humans to live in the state of nature before the advent of social institutions. In such a time, human beings had simple desires connected to simple needs that were simply satisfied.
Now this sort of gets into the idea of the noble savage. But as we'll see, and this is, a lot of this I understood about Rousseau, but part of what Truman really does nicely is say, well, it's not exactly chronological or historical, as we like to use that word.
There was no discontinuity or disconnect between what individuals thought or wanted and how they behaved. It was a world in which, to use the modern term, what you see is what you get where people are concerned. It is therefore the socializing of the human condition that has created the various problems that now afflict human existence. This pleasant innocence of the state of nature is an important theme in Rousseau's thinking, but must be qualified in a significant way to avoid misunderstanding. The state of nature for Rousseau is not a historical epoch. He is not attempting to describe actual history, so much as engage in a thought experiment. Rousseau's discourse does not set forth a historical narrative that, if discredited, thereby proves fatal to his philosophy. If there never was an era of noble savagery, then the basic point of his argument would still be sound.
Now, this is a really key point. And when I heard this morning, I thought, wow, this is really helpful. Oh, this goes a lot of different ways.
He is offering here not an insight into the past, but a theoretical construct for the purpose of making possible a distinction between nature and culture, and thereby laying the foundation for a critique of culture and its effects on the individual. This hypothetical state of nature essentially provides a basic measure by which the role of social conventions and institutions can be assessed in terms of their role in shaping human morals and behavior.
Now, right there, and that's why I highlighted it in the book. I should have probably done 2 sentences. I'll get the other one here. Oh, yeah, there we go. Oops. He's offering here not an insight into the past, but a theoretical construction for the purpose of making possible a distinction between nature and culture, and thereby laying the foundation for a critique of culture and the effect on the individual. So what we're going to do is now, instead of saying, well, way back when, before we had society, what he's actually doing is setting out a framework by which to judge good and evil, which is going to be in contrast to Augustine.
Lest we be in any doubt about the unfortunate impact of the sciences and the arts, Rousseau makes himself clear by moving straight from the words quoted above to comments on contemporary society. Today, when subtler inquiries and a more refined taste have reduced the art of pleasing to principles, a vile and deceiving uniformity prevails in our morals, and all minds seem to have been cast in the same mould. Constantly politeness demands, propriety commands. Constantly one follows custom, never one's own genius. One no longer dares to appear what one is, and under this perpetual constraint, the men who make up the herd that is called society will, when placed in similar circumstances, all act in similar ways, unless more powerful motives incline them differently.
Now, when you get into the question of Rousseau's actual behavior in life, now, of course, you can play a Bulverism on him here and say, well, he only concocted these ideas because he wanted to live the life, in fact, as he actually did. And you can find a whole variety of treatments of Rousseau and how he actually lived, and he was deplorable. Well, he abandoned his children because he didn't want to care for them. And his finances were a wreck because he didn't want to care for them. And just about everything in his life, including his health, was a wreck because he didn't want to care for them. But in fact, caring for something in terms of his definition of the world is in fact evil. Because nature is, in some ways, not caring. Or, let's say, only caring for that which our appetites demand that we care for them.
And this bleak description leads to even bleaker moral outcomes for human relationships and for society as a whole, as Rousseau continues. What a train of vices must attend upon such uncertainty. No more sincere friendships, no more real esteem, no more well-founded trust. Suspicions, offences, fears, coolness, reserve, hatred, betrayal will constantly hide beneath this even and deceitful veil of politeness, beneath this so much vaunted urbanity which we owe to the enlightenment of our century. In short, while education in the arts and sciences...
And so, when he says the enlightenment of our century, now you can see here, and there are a lot of tensions between Rousseau and the other philosophers, because at the heart of the Enlightenment is the idea of, you can hear it from Sam Harris, reason. We're going to look at the world and we're going to reason our way to less suffering and morality. And Rousseau is exactly the opposite. no, that's the reason is where you're having the trouble. It's that which springs forth from, now this is where authenticity and authority are going to come together, because it's that which springs forth unbidden, which is the true good. And you might say, well wait a minute. It would be natural to kiss her if other things didn't interrupt. For the founder of Hillsong, it would be natural to text the attractive young woman rather than to keep your desires to yourself and go on and stay faithful to your marriage vows. So why, Rousseau? How can you justify this? And again, most of us would say, well, this is absolutely crazy. But in a minute, we're going to see how this idea has, in fact, deeply lodged in our culture. And again, in many ways, it's the difference between My Fair Lady and Pretty Woman.
Might be expected to enhance humanity and improve life, Rousseau sees a real danger of exactly the opposite. It will, in reality, foster hypocrisy and wickedness, because it creates a society where the need to belong and to conform requires individuals to be false to who they really are.
Okay. This is where we get, Anselman was a little bit horrified at my question about truthfulness in government. And this business about truthfulness is a very complicated business. Did the founder, I should just pull up the article probably. So the founder of Hillsong megachurch has resigned over misconduct accusations. What did he do? Brian Houston, the founder of celebrity favorite mega church Hillsong, was resigned over misconduct allegations the church board announced. Hilson was under investigation for 2 complaints against him, the board of the Australian church said Friday. First complaint was about an incident 10 years ago, which involved inappropriate text messages from Pastor Brian to a member of the staff, which subsequently resulted in the staff member resigning. At the time, Pastor Brian was under the influence of sleeping tablets, upon which, it's a very British thing, sleeping tablets, not pills. We Americans say pills. Sleeping tablets, upon which he had developed a dependence. How unnatural of him. Or do these sleeping tablets actually make him more natural? The statement said Houston apologized to the person, and the board worked with Houston to get him professional help to eliminate his dependency on this medication. The board did not reveal the substance of these texts, but another Hillsong pastor previously said that they were along the lines of, "If I was with you, I'd like to kiss and cuddle you." Words of that nature, Australia's ABC News reported. So in other words, these sleeping tablets made him more natural and for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, more good, more authentic. Isn't it authentic? Wasn't it absolutely authentic for that pastor to text the young lady, and if I was with you, I'd kiss you and cuddle you? 10 years ago, he says this.
Society creates the rules by which the individual must play in order to be accepted, and those rules are contrary to the simple economy of easily met innate desires created by basic physical needs found in the state of nature.
Okay, so basically Rousseau says in the state of nature, well, see food, eat food. That's the state of nature. It's society that says, oh, Vanderclay, you don't have the same amount of testosterone you had surging through your body when you visited your grandma and she said, yeah, inside I feel like you feel. When I was 20 years old, I could eat anything I wanted to. Didn't gain a pound from it. It was lovely. My hair grew unbidden. I had to shave, but yeah, so what? That's just the way it goes. And my state of nature, certainly that was good. And now it's like, do I really need that bowl of ice cream at night? Doctor says I shouldn't, gain that extra weight, all that sugar and fat. I'm going to go to Synod, and you know what they're going to have? We're going to have breaks, multiple breaks a day, and we're going to have tables full of donuts and pastries. And it's going to be like, does this whole group of middle-aged and senior people really need more fat and sugar in their diet? And Rousseau would say, that's evil. Not that it's evil giving us that. It's evil stopping us. And again, I think about John Newton's autobiography, which is fascinating. Never equivocate, or that wasn't it. Never deliberate. That was his slogan as a young man. Never deliberate. It was Jean-Jacques Rousseau perfectly. And he found it made a mess of his life, which most of us would find, well, yeah, this is exactly what we do when we try to civilize someone out of it.
This claim is of great significance for understanding many of the pathologies of our current cultural moment. We might say that Rousseau is arguing at a basic level that it is society and the relations and conditions that society embodies that decisively shape, and the description above decisively corrupt individuals. That is a point so basic to much of modern liberal thought that it verges on the platitudinous. In Chapter 1, we noted the Hegelian concept of Sittlichkeit, picked up by Charles Taylor, as a useful means of highlighting the dialogical nature of how one constructs a sense of self. Sittlichkeit is the term used to refer to the ethical structure of society at large, embodying the code of behaviour to which one must conform in order to belong and to be accepted. Now, human beings are self-conscious, but their self-consciousness develops through interaction with the world outside the self, particularly with other similar self-consciousnesses, the grammar and syntax of which interaction is connected to the ethical expectations of society as a whole.
Okay, so the natural, the authentic, is that which I do without deliberation. It's what I do. Maybe if I drink or take these tablets and suddenly I lose my inhibitions, that's the natural. And on one hand, we say, well, that's exactly right. That's the natural. How does Lewis phrase it? It may have been wrong to kiss her, or even to text her to tell her that he'd like to kiss her, but it was very natural.
And this interactive development connects to another basic human desire, that of being recognized, of being accepted by others, in a manner that acknowledges one's identity. If we apply this dynamic to what Rousseau is claiming, his point seems to be that it is this desire to be recognized, set within a society whose Sittlichkeit or ethical framework inherently oppresses individual desires, that then proves so problematic. It is this tension that fosters ambition, a competitive and even destructive attitude to others, and that thereby, by introducing refinements and personal ambition, disrupts the balance that would exist in some primeval state.
Now again, remember that primeval state is a theoretical state. It need not have been a historical state. In other words, what Rousseau just wants us to be happy. And it's all of the stuff that we bump into when we have each other. I mean, it's almost an ethical solipsism where it's sort of C.S. Lewis's beginning of The Great Divorce, where you live in a world and you can have absolutely everything you want, except the gray city goes on and on and on and on because everybody keeps building houses because everybody's desire bumps into each other. Now, obviously, that pastor should not have texted the staffer about revealing his attraction to her. Attractions come unbidden. Should have kept it to himself and should have done the kind of inner work to, pour your love over to your wife, turn away from the attractive staffer. That's what he should have done. That's the Christian norm. But Rousseau is not quite so easily dispelled. Because on one hand, we look at this and say, oh, obviously, Rousseau is a major violator of Me Too. I mean, Rousseau, again, in some ways, he did live his life by this, and he is not celebrated for it. But these ideas are deep within our culture, remember, and culture of authenticity. I sometimes will quip to people who visit my church and say, well, my church has a tremendous amount of authenticity. In fact, it has way more authenticity than most people want. That's the way it is. Authenticity.
Authentic self-expression of the kind available to the hypothetical savage unencumbered by the expectations of culture, is therefore impossible to the one born in a civilized society, because that society will not allow such behavior, and is likely, in fact, to punish it. The authentic human being is regarded with contempt by cultivated society, perhaps even as a criminal. To be a member of such society, one must therefore suppress these personal natural desires and instincts and conform to socially normative canons of behavior. And in the process, one becomes inauthentic, untrue to one's inner real self. To use the modern phrase, one ends up living a lie.
And already you can begin to see where this is going.
The two loves. This is where an important distinction in Rousseau's thought is significant, that between amour de soi-même, self-love, and amour propre. In the
A more proper love.
hypothetical state of nature, human beings simply possess the first, self-love, a point Rousseau makes in part 1 of the second discourse.
And the 2-year-old possesses self-love. In fact, for most of us, the 2-year-old is the most self-loving creature there is, perhaps only in competition with the 1-year-old and the newborn. All they are is self-love. And, right away when the 2-year-old takes the toy away from the child sharing the playroom, suddenly that evil mother will intercede and say, "Oh no, don't hit, don't grab. You're stepping on that little soul's authenticity."
This is basically the desire for self-preservation. Human beings, in the hypothetical state of nature, desire to survive, to continue their own existence, and that is basic to who they are.
Now we see.
In his notes to the second discourse, note 15, Rousseau defines amour propre in contrast to self-love as follows. Amour propre is only a relative sentiment, factitious and born in society, which inclines every individual to set greater store by himself than by anyone else, inspires men with all the evils they do one another, and is the genuine source of honor.
Now notice honor. Well, honor is that way that we gain status or lose status by virtue of either coming in alignment with certain moral guidelines, which are, again, part of this societal interruption of the natural, authentic self.
In sum, self-love in the natural state is a good, leading individuals to seek self-preservation. Amour propre, however, is the result of the rivalries and interpersonal competitions and conflicts that society generates. This is what renders men and women corrupt, disingenuous, and false to themselves. There is some debate within scholarly circles as to whether amour propre in Rousseau is an intrinsically negative concept, or whether it is in itself morally neutral but typically manifested in immoral ways. In its negative, inflamed form, however, amour propre unequivocally consists in the pride, competitiveness, and desire for superiority and mastery over others that typify society. As he narrates a hypothetical history of society in the second discourse, Rousseau imagines how rivalries, envy, and discontent might develop in a social context as primitive people gathered at a tree or outside a hut. Everyone began to look at everyone else and to wish to be looked at himself, and public esteem acquired a price. The one who sang or danced best, the handsomest, the strongest, the most skillful, or the most eloquent, came to be the most highly regarded. And this was the first step at once toward inequality and vice. From these first preferences arose vanity and contempt on the one hand, shame and envy on the other. And the fermentation caused by these new leavens eventually produced compounds fatal to happiness and
the beginnings of inequality. Well, what is the state of our greatest equality? See food, eat food. There's our greatest equality. There's goodness itself. Any interruption in that is an interruption in our happiness. I just want my kids to be happy. Watch The Bachelor. All the parents, okay, you've gone on a game show that's designed to torture you, but I just want you to be happy. Okay? Is that really all you want from them? Well, why not the cocaine high and the bullet chaser? That's That's going out on top.
And innocence. Gone is the innocence of the natural man whose desires and needs were simple and matched each other perfectly. Now a competitive social sphere has been introduced that creates needs to be the best, to be the most highly regarded, to be the master,
Competition.
which by definition cannot be satisfied for all people all the time.
Inequality. Pareto distribution.
Thus comes inequality and the strife and struggles that mark human existence. All these problematic aspects of human behaviour come not as a result of some innate perversion that corrupts men and women from birth, but rather as that of existing in a social environment with others. It is the alien demands of that environment, to be better than this person, to be more beautiful than that one, that corrupt individuals and alienate them from who they really are. In this context, conscience, as we will see.
Okay, so who they really are. Well, again, this has to be a theoretical construct, because the truth is, no human being would ever live without the intervention from the parents. But who they really are. And again, read a little bio of Voltaire and you'll see he kind of lived this way and wasn't really terribly happy.
Acts as a means of reminding the individual of the fact that his best interests are served by empathizing with others and treating them as he would wish to be treated himself.
Oh, well, isn't this interesting? Because most of what we've seen now has sort of been, well, yeah, this is silly. This is ridiculous. This is insane. And somehow we got to the golden rule. And so right away you begin to say, well, this whole business of wanting is not so simple.
In contrast to amour propre, we should note that when Rousseau speaks of self-love as applied to the natural state, it is not a form of untrammeled selfishness, as the English translation might suggest. Further, the idea of self-preservation might also tend to imply that selfishness lies at the core of what it means to be human. One could easily imagine a world in which self-love might indeed be conceived of in such a way, given that any individual committed to an unqualified notion of self-preservation could well act in a manner hostile to all other individuals as potential threats to his own existence. But Rousseau does not think that this is the case. He would regard such a love as the very amour propre that is so problematic. Rather, he regards self-love in the natural state as coordinated with pity, as an intrinsic part of natural human virtue.
Oh. An intrinsic part of natural human virtue is pity. But yet, again, if Rousseau had bothered to raise any of his own children, he might have learned something from them, because there are few creatures as pitiless as a 2-year-old or an infant.
Rousseau defines pity as an innate repugnance to the idea of others who belong to the same species suffering.
And again, really? Oh, I don't know any people like this. It must be because they're all living in groups. Oh. Remember, this natural state is a purely theoretical state. Has to be.
The natural man does not like to see one of his fellows in pain or difficulty and will, if he can, act to alleviate such.
And again, think about Peterson's remarks on Auschwitz.
All the other social virtues, such as generosity and mercy, flow from this one basic source, as Rousseau says. There is, besides, another principle, which having been given to man in order under certain circumstances to soften the ferociousness of his amour propre, or of the desire for self-preservation prior to the birth of amour propre, tempers his ardour for well-being with an innate repugnance to see his kind suffer. I do not believe I need fear any contradiction in granting man the only natural virtue which the most extreme detractor of human virtues, Thomas Hobbes, was forced to acknowledge. I speak of pity, a disposition suited to beings as weak and as subject to so many ills as we are, a virtue all the more universal and useful to man as it precedes the exercise of all reflection in him, and so natural that even the beasts sometimes show evident signs of it.
Now, this, of course, today, many people would certainly say, oh, of course. Oh, well, it's absolutely natural and proper for us to stop and help the hurting. unless we believe we had justification for doing the hurting, or we believe that there was justification for their hurting. That's one of the most remarkable things in our culture today, that on one hand, people are so sensitive to all sorts of sufferings, unless, of course, they believe that the sufferings are justifiable. Well, you can run roughshod over huge percentages of the population who have traditional ideas, and in the pursuit of progress demand that their traditional ideas be abandoned for the sake of a tiny little suffering minority. Well, what about the suffering of all of those people who held the traditional ideas? No. I'm 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 liberating them from their unnatural, their inauthentic ideas. But weren't those ideas authentic to them, given when and where they were raised and the situations in which they were raised? Oh no. It's society that makes you suffer. It's these natural, authentic things that come in from below that are liberating. Unless, of course, you have a dependence on sleeping tablets and a text phone in the middle of the night, and you're thinking of your coworker instead of your wife.
This is a noteworthy passage because it makes clear that Rousseau, in addition to setting up a contrast between the innocence of the natural state and the corruption of society, roots his understanding of ethics in personal sentiment. It is empathy that shapes self-love in a manner that makes human beings moral. As he argues in the second discourse, pity or empathy in the natural state takes the place of laws, morals, and virtue, because it naturally moves us toward alleviating the suffering of others.
Now, if you pay attention, you will hear this regularly. And it will be I can't understand how these people with traditional ideas have no empathy for that group over there. Something must have interrupted them. I'm sure they were socialized by some tyrannical tradition that perhaps taught them such evil things as human depravity or total depravity. What we need is empathy, and if we sort of free everyone from these constraints, empathy will arise. Well, the irony of Pastor Houston is that freeing him from probably some of his more developed faculties of conscientious restraint and closed-mouthedness brought about a situation in which he was very unempathetic to the staffer, who really had no romantic interest in her boss, and found his texting to be quite unwelcome. What happened to that empathy coming up within? Do you think that in some ways this kind of natural desire that people have, well, of course, again, this stuff just falls apart, but it's deep among us and quite common. And it's not difficult, as I'm doing right now, to sort of point out the inconsistencies. It's in fact extremely easy. But in all fairness to Rousseau, it's when we have this shared cultural imaginary and that we fear the demotion of our status to say something against the tide of human opinion right now that people shrink back and shut up and have difficulty finding a counterexample that says, well, maybe Pastor Houston's problem was that, in fact, he needed a little bit more inhibition and he should have shut up. Because you know what? A lot of these little desires, if you don't feed them, they go away.
We empathize with those in pain and therefore are motivated to relieve their suffering. Moral imperatives may well present themselves as having an intrinsic authority and status, but they find their origin and foundation in a personal sentiment, an emotional reaction to circumstances, that of the empathy and pity that someone naturally feels in the natural state for some other one of their kind who is in pain or difficulty. Human ethical action thus arises out of psychological sentiment. It is the fact that we are naturally empathetic that makes us moral.
Okay, so now Well, look at how we play out the Ukrainian-Russian business. Well, the Russian people, the good Russian people, the natural Russian people, they don't know about what their own government is doing to Ukraine. Well, that may very well be true. And, well, but does it mean that if they knew, they would do great things to stop it?
Rousseau makes this thinking clear in Emile, his treatise on education, when discussing the terminology of public morality. I would show that justice and goodness are not merely abstract words, pure moral beings formed by the understanding, but are true affections of the soul, enlightened by reason, are hence only an ordered development of our primitive affections, that by reason alone, independent of conscience, no natural law can be established, and that the entire right of nature is only a chimera if it is not founded on a natural need in the human heart.
Here we have an anthropology of goodness. That, well, justice and goodness are self-evident. And it's in moving away the societal things that impede people from pursuing what comes most natural to them.
In an important footnote to this passage, Rousseau uses as an example of that most basic of ethical principles the maxim that you should do unto others as you would wish them to do to you. Even this code, he argues, is rooted in a prior sentimental capacity, for it depends on the ability to identify with others in their condition, and therefore to desire for them what you would desire for yourself. Pity as a foundation for ethics therefore points towards two important elements of Rousseau's thought. The first is the social dimension of human beings, even in their hypothetical natural state, for pity is always directed toward another. It cannot exist in perfect isolation as a solipsistic virtue. As noted above, self-love is not a matter of untrammeled self-interest at the expense of all others, nor is it exemplified in a kind of splendid isolation. The key to appropriate self-love is that the individual's desires are connected to basic needs and do not exceed them. Enough food to eat, a mate for companionship and procreation, and sufficient rest to keep the body healthy.
There it is. Well, it's a little difficult to imagine that, well, greed. Well, and again, now let's add some modern anthropology and project it back through Rousseau's imagination. Well, you wouldn't kill all the buffaloes. You'd only kill what you needed, because actually killing a buffalo is a tremendously difficult and life-threatening thing. So nature would be in balance. It's only the train and the gun and all of these other things that would kill all the buffalo and have all the waste.
As to the fears of the man in the state of nature, those fears are simple, merely pain and hunger. Other desires and other fears, and the concomitant disturbance that they bring to individuals, are the fruit of amour propre, and thus of the society that is its necessary precondition. The key to basic social ethics is therefore the ability to empathize with others and apply to them the same principles as you would apply to yourself. Each individual is to relate to every other individual in a way that respects his or her own personal integrity and sovereignty.
It's right there, isn't it? Isn't that the foundation of our modern ethic?
Problems emerge only when one person tries to dominate another.
So underneath you also have this rather libertarian vision of how we relate to one another.
The second important element of Rousseau's thought that emerges in the discussion of pity and the foundation of ethics and sentiment is that he sees aesthetics as key to morality. The virtuous person is the one whose instincts, whose sentimental or emotional responses to particular situations are correctly attuned. No law can make men or women moral if their sentiments are not properly ordered.
Now, what you see in, let's say, something like The Bachelor is, well, I have to follow my heart. I have to follow my guts. Now part of that is true, because in some ways your rationality is not that bright, and your rational mind should in some ways be subject to the master and not have the emissary become the master. Yet it's always back and forth. It's always got to be back and forth.
This is an extremely significant notion. It has obvious implications for education. If human beings in the state of nature have naturally correct sentiments, then the purpose of education in the real, actual world in which we live becomes not what it was traditionally conceived as being: the training of individuals in the intellectual, social, and moral competencies necessary for being a member of society.
Wisdom, passing on of what was known by past generations, giving as an inheritance. Well, once this Rousseauian idea gets enough steam in a culture, well, the worst thing you can do is teach them all of this Western civilization. That's all completely marred by all of these other things.
On the contrary, education is about allowing the person to mature in a manner that protects her from precisely those cultural influences that traditional schooling is designed to cultivate and that merely inflame amour propre. These serve only to alienate her from who she really is, making her inauthentic. By rooting ethics in sentiment, Rousseau also provides an obvious and instructive point of comparison with the emotivism that Alistair MacIntyre sees as characterizing the way ethical discourse is to be understood today. In the latter scheme, to say that something is good is in reality merely to express a personal emotional preference. For Rousseau, ethical discourse is about personal sentiments, which amounts to the same thing, although he would reject moral relativism as a necessary implication.
And because again, it's this common natural layer beneath us. I believe that all people are the same.
In dealing with the issue of sentiment or emotional response, we should of course acknowledge that ethics typically does involve something along the lines of what Rousseau suggests. If I see an old man being attacked by muggers in the street, and I need to Google, is mugging old men a good or a bad thing, before acting, most people would say that I'm behaving in a manner that shows a level of moral inadequacy on my part. Responding to something like a mugging should be intuitive. Either I run to help or I take immediate steps to fetch help, without really engaging in any discursive reasoning based on first principles. We might say that to be a moral person, my instincts or my sentiments need to be properly attuned to the situation, and that it is those instincts, and not any heteronomous law, that motivate me to act. Sentiments, emotions, and aesthetic considerations form an important part of ethical activity. Nevertheless, between Rousseau and our day, there has clearly been a significant change, as witnessed by the rampant ethical subjectivism of our modern culture of anarchic emotive morality and expressive individualism. There is now no consensus about what it is that should evoke our empathy and sympathy: the baby in the womb, or the pregnant teenager whose life will be utterly disrupted by having a child, the transgender teen who wants to become a woman, or his parents who fear he is making a terrible mistake. The ethic Rousseau articulates may be rooted in sentiment, but is not quite the same as the emotionally driven ethical subjectivism we have today. On the contrary, Rousseau sees empathy as having a universal stability because it is grounded in his confident assertion of a universal human nature possessing a conscience that is the same for everyone. Indeed, in Emile, he has the Savoyard vicar of Book 4 define conscience as follows: there is in the depths of souls, then, an innate principle of justice and virtue, according to which, in spite of our own maxims, we judge our actions and those of others as good or bad. It is to this principle that I give the name conscience. So important is this understanding of conscience to Rousseau that he then places the following eulogy to conscience in the mouth of the Savoyard vicar. Conscience, conscience, divine instinct, immortal and celestial voice, certain guide of a being that is ignorant and limited, but intelligent and free, infallible judge of good and bad, which makes man like unto God. It is you who make the excellence of his nature and the morality of his actions. Without you I sense nothing in me that raises me above the beasts, other than the sad privilege of leading myself astray from error to error, with the aid of an understanding without rule and a reason without principle. There is a sense in which Rousseau here says nothing that many Orthodox Christians of his day, especially Protestants, would not have affirmed. There is an internal, intuitive moral compass that guides and directs the individual in right behavior toward others. As in the example of the mugging above, instinct plays a significant role in how we behave in the moral sphere. There are, however, significant differences between the views of Rousseau and those of traditional Protestantism that are decisive for his construction of conscience. Unlike the Augustinian stream of Christian thought, of which Orthodox Protestantism is one development, Rousseau does not regard human beings as innately perverted. For Augustine, it is precisely the fact that human beings are born depraved and subject to internal moral conflict and confusion that renders sentiment and instinct unreliable, even positively deceptive guides to moral action. For Rousseau, however, individuals are intrinsically good, with sentiments that are properly ordered and attuned to ethical ends, until they are corrupted by the forces of society. Thus there is no tension in his thinking between conscience and will, other than that generated by being a member of society, and thus being made vulnerable to the perverted ambitions of an inflamed amour propre. For Rousseau, the individual is at his best. He is most truly himself, as he should be, when he acts in accordance with his nature. This is the deep principle of Rousseau's understanding of authentic personhood and of ethics. And conscience is the internal, pristine, and for Rousseau, God-given voice that points each one in this direction. It is society, with its temptations and its corruptions, that prevents conscience from being the omnipotent governor of human action. Here we have the conceptual framework for understanding the incidents with the theft of the asparagus and the encounter with Zulietta. In both cases, Rousseau's sin, if we can call it such, was the result of the perversion of his natural sentiments by the demands and expectations of society. Had he been at one with his nature, then he would not have behaved or thought as he did. Again, this notion finds expression in another powerfully phrased passage where Rousseau praises the nature of true moral freedom. But the eternal laws of nature and order do exist. For the wise man, they take the place of positive law. They are written in the depth of his heart by conscience and reason. It is to these that he ought to enslave himself in order to be free. The only slave is the man who does evil, for he always does evil in spite of himself. Freedom is found in no form of government. It is in the heart of the free man. He takes it with him everywhere. The vile man takes his servitude everywhere. The latter would be a slave in Geneva, the former a free man in Paris. The one who is truly free is the one who is free to be himself. We might recast this and say that the one who is shaped by society and not by his own conscience and reason is truly a slave. Alienated from his true self and in bondage to the demands of the society in which he lives, he is consequently less human, less authentic than the one who acts in accordance with his own nature. It does not matter in what social or political context the evil man finds himself. He is always less than free, always less than he should be, because he is never walking in obedience to that inner voice that should guide him. It is following that inner voice that makes one truly free, truly authentic.
Following that inner voice that makes one truly free, truly authentic. How many movies, TV shows, this is at the bedrock of authenticity, authorship, authority.
Our access to the true order of the world and our place in it is thus primarily inward.
I'm going to summarize it instead of the conclusion that he ends that chapter with, which is another 9 minutes. I thought the beginning of the next chapter was quite a good summary of what he had just started.
Chapter 4. Unacknowledged Legislators. Wordsworth, Shelley, and Blake. Man is a poetical animal. William Hazlitt. In Jean-Jacques Rousseau's emphasis on self-love, sentiment, empathy, conscience, and the contrast between the hypothetical state of nature and the manner in which society can, and typically does, lead to inflamed amour propre, we can see emerging the basic outlines of modern expressive individualism. The real identity of an individual is to be found in the inner psychological autobiography. The authentic individual...
Okay, the inner psychological autobiography. That's my grandmother not aging. That's me not aging. That inner psychological autobiography. That's my true self. Now, what ought to happen, and this is, again, you got to be really careful here, because my true self, my outward self, should follow the fully fledged inner autobiography. Pastor Houston should not have texted his staffer. The texting of her was a certain self manifesting through the phone to the staffer. Again, this is Pretty Woman versus My Fair Lady. The question is, what is the source of this inner autobiographical self? Should that source be formed? And what is the venue upon which that source is formed?
Individual is one who behaves outwardly in accordance with this inner psychological nature. Society and its conventions are the enemy, suppressing desire and perverting the individual in a way that prevents the real, authentic self from being able to express itself. The essential dynamics of the modern understanding of the self are therefore already in place in the thought of Rousseau by the late 18th century. The question with which I started, however, remains: how did such ideas originally floated in elite intellectual circles, become not simply the common currency of our society, but so deeply embedded in such that most people never reflect on them in any critical or self-conscious way, and are apparently convinced that they are simply a natural part of our existence? To understand that, we need to see how ideas akin to those of Rousseau serve to reshape culture more generally. And that brings us to the artistic movement known as Romanticism.
Okay, we'll stop there. Now you can sort of see the way this thing is going to play out in our culture, because we can't, the authenticity is that which comes unbidden from within. And it's our duty, in fact, to express that, to bring that from the upper register into the lower register, although now to confuse this, from within to the outside. And it's the job of the culture to facilitate that expression. What's often forgotten, however, is, of course, the fact that, well, is this just coming from within inside? Hasn't what's inside also come from outside to build what is inside? The process is a lot more complicated. And the question of, well, what is good? This is Michelle Goldberg's review of Emba's Rethinking Sex that I mentioned in yesterday's video. Rethinking Sex speaks the language of both radical feminism and traditional Christian ethics. It quotes Ellen Willis and Thomas Aquinas, Andrea Dworkin, and Roger Scruton. Emba critiques sex positivity, at least in its popular form, as submission to a patriarchal capitalist values. Isn't that interesting? But there's a strong streak of conservatism in her work. Among her chapter titles are Our Sex Lives Aren't Private and Some Desires Are Worse Than Others. It would be easy enough to pick out the passages where Emba's judgmentalism gets the better of her. Judgmentalism? Well, that's exactly this societal critique of the natural, authentic self, where she fails to exercise the empathy. That's exactly the source of this Rousseauian ethic. It's empathy. She later holds up as as a crucial value. Sure, the double standard around sex is shrinking, but in many of the situations, we've held up as enlightened the casual, kinky, polyamorous, experimental. Well, of course, in some ways, well, Rousseau is down there too. This is the natural self seeking its fulfillment, in contrast to all of the social, all the social things getting in the way. The actual practice of sex seems less pleasant than it did before, when there was very little held back. Okay, well, sex is very clearly upper and lower register, very deeply in many ways. An editor might have asked, before when, and for whom? Sure, the pressures told libertinism can feel coercive, particularly for those who want conventional romance. But in the not so secret past, the pressure on sexual nonconformists was even more oppressive. Their true self were sexual nonconformists, and the pressure was coercive. That's society. Rousseau is all over this. I'm more interested, though, in what Emba gets right. which is what modern heterosexual dating culture appears to be, an emotional meat grinder whose miseries and degradations can't be solved by ever more elaborate rituals of consent. Now I write this as an outsider, having married young. She's sort of a reverse Rousseau. And this is often a point that people make, that the most successful libertines publicly are those who live puritanical lives privately. But the stories I hear from many of my friends match those Emba tells, and there's plenty of empirical data about growing romantic loneliness and alienation. What's alienation? Alienation is the separation between what feels authentic and what I am able to produce and embody in the lower register. Fewer adults have live-in partners than in recent decades, and younger people, despite their apparent panoply of options, are having less sex. In different ways, both genders have lost their confidence in their ability to be together. They no longer know how to do it correctly, or even if it's possible, Emba writes. As a step towards a solution, she proposes replacing the transactional approach to sex with an ethic of what Aquinas calls willing the good of the other, in other words, love, or determining to act in one's partner's best interest, and not only in one partner's best interest now, all the way forward. And this, in fact, is a deep problem in Rousseau, in that there's the now and the always. So this is the now and this is the always. And time is right there in the middle of it. And what human beings need is a capacity to live through time. And that, in many ways, is wisdom. This sounds nice in theory, but often heterosexual women are too willing to act in what they believe to be their partner's best interest rather in their own. Heterosexual partners are too sacrificial. So we want love in terms of willing for the good of the other, but it better not involve sacrifice on my part for the sake of the other. The loving thing for the founder of the Hillsong Church towards his office subordinate would have been to shut up and look away and move on, rather than pursuing the authentic, which we say is not honoring your marriage vows. A woman who confided to Emba about choking surely thinks she's doing something good for her partner by indulging him. Oh, that's interesting. And what's interesting is that, okay, Goldberg, you understand something about the sacrificial nature of love, but this begs the question of the larger frame. Well, Bachelor spoiler alert, our boy Clayton eventually stuck with Susie, at least for now, and Rachel, who promised her never-ending love to him, well, it ended pretty quickly. It's difficult that way. This world of transactions, this world of going through time, how does one love for the distance? I asked yesterday about the question about authority and whether an institution which has lost its authority can regain it. Now, when people read a story like this, they sort of say, see, Christians can't inhabit their own sexual ethic. True enough. It's an ambitious one. But when you actually see an organization doing something like this, and it seems a rather dramatic measure, the allegations, at least at this point, seem fairly small, but to step down. There's an organization trying to live out its ethic. And this is where you get into the question of principalities. because it's a collective organization, this Hillsong megachurch and their network of megachurches. And they're working on trying to figure out how they can embody the ideals of the church. So, takes a lot of guts to step down. Will that mean in our culture that they have the authenticity necessary to be seen as having authority? Well, we'll continue to play these things out. But I wanted to do this because I think actually this idea that we covered with Rousseau is actually pretty important. That this hypothetical state of nature essentially provides a basic measure by which the role of social conventions and institutions can be assessed in terms of their role in shaping human morals and behaviors. Once you're aware of these practices, you begin to see them all over the place. And it's good to pay attention, because once you can see them, you can have a degree of understanding. And then you can begin to ask some harder questions of people who are sort of naively living in them. Is this really the world you want to live in? Is this really the basis of goodness? Does this assumption about human nature adequately account for not only the lives that you see your rivals or adversaries live, but your own? Yet Rousseau remains. We'll see how this wears in the secret, sacred self down below that just needs to be expressed and come out. We'll see how that self travels through time. Because even though myself and my grandmother had this inner psychological autobiographical self traveling through time, we also travel through with this decaying physical aging body. And it's in this world that all of these relationships must work. Had a conversation with a gentleman who I hadn't seen him for a while. He was a intermittent visitor to the church, himself and his wife. And he came into church without her. It had been a while, and she had often looked like she was struggling with health issues. So I asked him, "How is your wife?" And he immediately teared up and said she had passed 3 months ago. Had a follow-up phone call with him to just give him a little care. I think he's having difficulty finding a church that fits who he is. He's quite conservative, and his wife was quite conservative. And I asked how long he had been married. 60 years. And he said, we met, fell in love, and were together a lot of our married life. Described how he had passed the last 20 years since he had retired, what joy they had, and you can just tell in listening to him how much he misses his wife. Now, certainly not every long marriage is quite so happy. Marriage is a difficult thing. But what those two received, he had a Dutch Calvinist background. She had a background from a different culture, not Anglo, but she was also a Christian. They learned to love each other sacrificially, and they found joy in that. And I'm sure, as anyone who begins the process of marriage knows, it's not natural to deny yourself and begin to live for your spouse. And if you're living for each other sacrificially and well, it can be a wonderful thing. And again, not every marriage is quite so happy. There are times at the end of a long marriage where the one partner who buries the other gives a sigh of relief because they've held on for a long time out of love, out of faithfulness to vows, out of the welfare of their children and community. It's really complex. But I don't think Rousseau gets any of this right. And the way he lived his own life in many ways betrayed the poverty of his insights. And that isn't to say that there aren't some insights that can be gathered from him with a degree of profit. You can find insights from many different people. But this idea that never deliberate, it's not deliberate, never, I keep forgetting what Newton's thing was, which is basically never pause and think, doesn't actually lead to much happiness, as people are discovering. So they might better look for a better way. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment.